Hello and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer with me, Anna Isabel, and I am so delighted to welcome back Anita Chakraburtti. Hello, Anita.
Hi Anna, thanks for inviting me onto your wonderful podcast.
It's a joy, and you're here because a talk that you have just given for the Astrological Lodge of London about ADHD in the birth chart. And I don't know when I was looking at the program how I missed it, but I missed it. And and when I saw that, I thought, oh, hang on a minute. That is something we do need to talk about. So here you are. Maybe it might be good to begin with what ADHD actually is.
Yeah, because everyone's got different levels of knowledge about it. Some people just know it as those four letters and don't know anything about it, and other people are experts in it. So it's good to set a baseline. So the cause is genetic, and it can be inherited from your parents, yeah, or grandparents. So you're more likely to have a child with ADHD if you or your partner has it. But because it's genetic, it's a bit like saying I didn't have ADHD as a child, but I've developed it as an adult. That's a bit like saying I had brown eyes when I was little, now I've got blue eyes. It's never going to happen. Yeah, so it is genetic. However, the levels of impairment can be impacted by environmental factors from when you were young. Okay, but in terms of actual causation, they haven't knotted down environmental stuff really or social stuff, but they have discussed genetic polymorphisms that impact serotonin, dopamine, and adrenaline, basically. So, serotonin is to do with mood and happiness and joy. Um, Dopamine is that kind of reward neurotransmitter that gets you, is a motivational neurotransmitter because you want the reward. And adrenaline is to do with stress and also drive and motivation as well. So they're kind of the three hormones that are involved in it. And look, it manifests, there are two main categories of ADHD. So the first one is inattentiveness, and there are a lot of different manifestations. So that's about difficulty in concentrating, difficulty in focusing, lack of attention to detail, uh, starting new tasks without fully completing previous tasks, poor organisation, misplacing things, forgetfulness. And obviously, a lot of your listeners now are going to go, oh, yeah, I do that. I forget things. I misplace things. I don't always finish tasks. I've got my spare room that's still being renovated and I've been trying to do it for like 3 years. But I started on the kitchen. Time blindness, yeah. So where they can underestimate tasks in terms of how long it's going to take. They might be at work in a working environment and they might say to their boss, oh, yeah, this delivery that you've asked me to do, I can deliver that within a week. Yeah. And a week goes by and they've barely started it because they completely underestimated it. Or, you know, there could be the reverse. They think a piece of work is going to take them a long time and it takes them a quick amount of time. There can also be this just kind of messiness, disorder, chaos. Okay, so that's one level. So that's more the inattentiveness. Then there's that sort of hyperactivity and impulsiveness behavior. So that's why there's this restlessness, mood swings, quick temper, irritability, motivational issues. So they might struggle to motivate themselves more about tasks that they're not interested in, which is part of life. But people with ADHD just will not do the boring stuff. And some of them find cooking boring, so they'll just eat takeaways. And because they struggle with tasks and the sequential order of things, and these are people that are very affected. Something like, I'm half Italian. To me, making pasta, I could do it blindfolded with, if I haven't slept for like 5 days, I could still make a pasta sauce and a pasta dish. And yeah, someone with ADHD, the boiling of the pasta, the separate making of the sauce, the frying the onion and garlic, then you combine it, you drain it For them, it's just too overwhelming. So they'll just get a delivery or just get something to shove in the oven. There's hyper-focus hangovers. So ADHD people can really, really focus on a task that they love, and they can spend days completely studying this task. And then once they've gone through days of being completely focused on a task, for a couple of days after, they just can't focus on anything because it's like they've melted their brain. In terms of children, you can see with children with ADHD in the classroom, blurting out responses all the time, not being able to wait their turn, with the physical fidgeting, getting up, walking around the classroom, not being able to sit still. Going back to the inattentiveness with children, some teachers will say, I'm speaking to the child in an empty classroom with no distractions, and I'm looking at this child and I'm giving them instruction, and they are just not listening. I can see they are not listening even when there is no stimuli around them. So there are some ways. So that's really those two categories. There's the inattentiveness, and then there's that hyperactivity and impulsiveness. They're the two main categories. But people with ADHD may also have other manifestations of other different types of categories of medical problems, such as anxiety and depression, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Some children can have oppositional defiance disorder. So even a parent in the home wants to tell their child, can you get your dirty laundry and can you put it in the washing machine? But even saying it like that, the child will just want an argument about it. So the parent that's been working full time and done a 2-hour commute has got to try and think of a way that doesn't sound instructional to get that child to do something simple. Because just going, get your dirty clothes and put it in the washing machine, that'll be it. There'll just be an argument. So again, you have to word things in a different way so it doesn't sound like an instruction. Dyspraxia, where the kids struggle with, catching balls and kicking balls and doing sport. So, you're already feeling isolated because you keep putting your hand up and trying to answer questions, because you blurt into conversations, because in the playground you can't take your turn. You're already probably getting a little bit socially isolated. And then you can't catch a ball, you can't kick a ball. So, there can be a lot of loneliness and isolations. And then dyslexia can also be a factor when
I think,
something.
listening to you, you can understand why anxiety would accompany this, as would low self-esteem and everything else, because there is the constant message of not fitting in. And I think too, it's interesting that you point out that there is a genetic factor in this that's very real, because I have seen several studies about the impact of diet on ADHD, as well as lack of father involvement in the early years, and particularly with boys, not having enough physical play with father as well. So it's interesting that you're pointing out, that this is genetic, but then there are many other factors which can really switch this on and make it difficult. And then, of course, we have the low, we're putting these children into school environments that are not conducive to learning for your average child, let alone a child who finds it difficult to focus, finds it difficult to follow instructions, finds it difficult to sit still. All of these things are not good for children in the first place, the sitting still for hours and having to listen for hours instead of play, because play is such an important developmental factor. So we have that, and then we have the difficulty that these children, the added difficulty that goes beyond being a child. And of course, it's one of the reasons why boys find it so much harder in school, because they're wired to play and be physical, and they're having to sit and listen. So there's all these different factors. And that immediately...
And the other thing, sorry to interrupt you, a lot of the studies that are online and that you can access via PubMed, etc., most of them involve children, but there are adults with ADHD who are going through you know, HR disciplinary procedures because they've been given tasks, they've been given deadline in their office, yeah, where they work. And because they can't work sequentially, because they overestimate tasks, underestimate tasks, because they struggle with instruction, because they're a bit disorganized, they're failing to deliver. And the manager's getting on their case, which is causing them stress, causing them anxiety, which makes them probably more panicking about delivering. And, you know, these things are leading to disciplinaries and people getting the sack if, as adults. So, you know, there's
Exactly. And it's
a
school all
whole
over again.
category of people that are kind of not in the system.
Yeah, it's school all over again because, you know, and particularly now school is beginning to look more and more like the workplace, even at young age, you know, with children having to do, you know, extraordinary amounts of homework, etc., etc. So we've got that. That's the background. We've got this in, I think, anti-human system. So we've got an anti-human system which is difficult for the average person, let alone somebody who has added issues. And as you were talking about all of those traits, obviously I'm thinking about the air signs and I'm thinking about the fire signs.
Yeah,
what are
absolutely.
you seeing in charts?
Yeah, so there's lots of different indicators that I've found because I've, you know, worked with clients. I have to say that when I work with clients who've got ADHD, they're not coming to me because of ADHD. They're coming to me because of menstrual issues or arthritis or digestive issues or autoimmune or, and then kind of towards the end of our, you know, first consult, they might go, oh, look, I've had a diagnosis of ADHD, or I haven't had a diagnosis, but I think I might have it. If you can do some work on that, that'd be great, you know, but normally people are coming to me for health issues that are non-ADHD related, and then they'll tell me. So in looking at clients' charts, and then obviously looking at famous people's charts, you know, like Tom Hanks and Jamie Oliver, and I'm trying to think of who I've been looking at, Ozzy Osbourne and Robbie Williams, whatever. Yeah, there are certain traits that I've seen. Yeah. So yeah, you're right. Fire signs, dominance in fire, dominance in air, which makes complete sense because there's that impulsivity with the fire signs and that kind of lack of tenacity and persistence with fire signs. They love all the new novelty, which is a bit of that impulsiveness side of ADHD, but they're not very good finishers because they're like magpies chasing the next interesting thing. And also that kind of mood, you know, that anger, irritability, whatever. And then the air signs where there's that, you know, changeability with them again, but there's also that inquisitiveness where they are more likely to kind of get quite absorbed in things. But there's also that kind of looking into lots of different things, and maybe that again that lack of persistence, tenacity that you might get in more of an earth sign. Yeah. The other thing is combust planets, specifically Mercury and specifically Jupiter. I can't remember if I've seen that many Mars, but definitely Mercury and Jupiter, so within like 8 degrees of the sun. So that seems to be a factor in ADHD, people with ADHD. Mercury obviously ruling the mind, decision making, learning, communication. Mercury in detriment, so or in fall. So Mercury in Sagittarius, Mercury in Pisces, or Mercury in water signs. You think of Mercury in water signs, and a retrograde Mercury, you know, that kind of approach to learning is different. It's not going to be the memorize all this stuff for hours and hours and then regurgitate it. Yeah. And then we'll test you on how much you've learned. But it's not, you know, it's not a lot of critical thinking going on, is there? It's just like memorize and then regurgitate. And it doesn't fit well with water signs or Mercury in Sag or Mercury in Pisces. Jupiter in detriment, Jupiter in fall, so Jupiter in Virgo, Jupiter in Gemini, Jupiter in Capricorn, watery Jupiters as well, because Jupiter's about the higher mind. And it's also connected to higher education as well. So, you know, let's leap forward, you know, from school, then we go to university. And if you make it that far, you're in an even more difficult situation in university because you know, you're not really going to get disciplined if you miss lectures, if you miss assignments. They'll just say at the end of the year, yeah, you're not going to the second year. Sorry, you know, you've not self-motivated enough to deliver what you're meant to deliver this year. So bye.
It's interesting that you talk about Jupiter and Virgo, because this being an Earth sign, and as we were saying, the elements that jump to mind would be air and fire, and then obviously Mercury and water signs, because Mercury will check out when it's in a water sign if it's bored. So, or if it's not emotionally engaged in, and I have taught many a child with Mercury and water, and I know that unless I make this an appealing story for them, they're going to check out. They're going to be looking out the window daydreaming. They are not interested unless I make it something, that I remember, telling stories to teach certain children about numbers and adding. Uh,
Oh,
because
great.
otherwise they were just not going to be interested. So, that makes sense. The Jupiter in Virgo, though, I think is really interesting because it's I call it the everything is important syndrome, and not being able to prioritize, which is a big thing. Everything is important. How do I know what to do first?
Yeah.
It's
And there might be that element of perfectionism there as well, which might be a little bit OCD, which then leads to difficulties.
and then the Jupiter in Capricorn, also very challenging in its own right, because everything has to be right. There's right and there's wrong, and there's nothing in between. It's so that's very, very difficult, because what we're seeing is Jupiter amplifying the potential neuroses of Virgo and Capricorn there.
Yeah, yeah, which is about perfectionism, doing things right, doing things in, being the best as well, Um, Other things that I've seen is Cancer, Saturn in Cancer. Saturn in water signs. Saturn's about structure. It's about sequentially going from A to B to C, making a plan, prioritizing, doing all that foundational stuff. So a weak Saturn, so a watery Saturn again, that leads to a bit more, chaos, a little bit of disorganization. And then Saturn in, poor conditions, Saturn in fall as well. So Saturn in Leo, Saturn in Cancer, Saturn in Aries. So a weak Saturn or an afflicted Saturn will impact structure in that person's way of learning and way of functioning in the world.
You talked about for I'm just going to say the clumsiness aspect that comes with it sometimes because of the lack of coordination. And I'm just wondering whether you have a marker for that.
Um, Not specifically. I mean, the moon is about the physical body. Um, I would say, well, it's not something I've analysed, so I'm kind of speaking completely off the top of my head because I've more looked at the learning, the structure, the organisation, the mood, and the fieriness, but I'd probably look at the physical body and maybe a lot of Gemini. Perhaps,
Now, see, I had Gemini
nervous
sign.
system, which is about the muscles and activation of muscles. I'd a guess. It's not something I've really studied.
No, I see, I had Gemini in mind, and not due to a lack of coordination, because I don't think that is at all a Gemini issue. But it's the level of embodiment, that we might have. And I was only just having this conversation with a client about 3 days ago with a Gemini ascendant, because of her being so prone to accidents. And I was talking to her about this because, having a fair amount of Gemini myself, I recognized exactly what she was talking about, and also other Gemini ascendants that I know. And I said to her, are you aware of your feet? And she looked at me, and she thought about it, and she said, No, because the accidents she has are all about having her feet in the wrong place, accentuated by a hypermobility. That means her ankles are prone to
Oh yeah, turning over.
turning. And I was saying to her, you know, I asked that because I've been through this where I used to be one for falling downstairs.
Wow.
I had the most dramatic falls downstairs and once at a tube station from the top all the way to the bottom. And I realized after that fall, because it was one of those where literally I saw everything happening in slow motion. That's how serious that fall was. And I came out of it with some swollen knees, but nothing broken and okay. But I started to analyze how I walked downstairs, and I realized I was not aware of my feet because my feet were barely touching the steps. And and so I would be on the edge like this. And it only took one false move for me to do that and slip. And when I mentioned it to her, she went, "Oh," she said, "I've fallen down the stairs doing that." So, you know, it's this, and I said to her, it's because we're thinking about where we're going and we're not focusing on where we are. Our minds are well ahead of where we are. And she went, yes.
It might
So,
also be the brain and the hemisphere, you know, the left and right sides of the body not coordinated, not working in unison, almost like two independent people in Gemini, you know, like,
yeah,
yeah, and that
it
affects
could
the
be.
cross walking, the left, right, catching hands. Yeah, it's the
Yeah,
brain, it's the
it
hemispheres.
could be that. It's never occurred to me that it was that. For me, it was, I'm basically not paying attention. I'm not fully in my body paying attention to what my body is doing because my mind is already on that train that's coming. And she was experiencing it in the same way. So it really made me think about air signs and the embodiment issue. Are we fully in our bodies? Are we fully connected with our bodies? And so when you were talking about that, I thought, oh yeah, I was just, and it's not to say that she has ADHD or that I have ADHD. It's not that. But the way that you talk about ADHD, there's a massive spectrum. And as you said, we could all recognize different aspects of that. And so when we're looking at the chart and we're seeing that certain signs are going to have a tendency in a certain direction, and which is then going to be amplified by certain planetary positions and of course the aspects in the charts. And now we're looking at an additional genetic predisposition and an environment that is not supporting the condition but is instead exacerbating it. So everything comes back to that, doesn't it?
Yeah, and with as with lots of different conditions that people have, there's various levels of impairment. You might have a lot of these different, you know, inattentiveness characteristics and the, you know, the hyperactive, you know, tendencies, but you may be completely functioning well in society. You've got a good job, you're progressing up the hierarchy, you've got a lot of friends because they're kind of low level, all of these things. But you might only have a few of the inattentiveness and a few of the hyperactive, but they might be very, very kind of high end, which is completely impacting the way you function in society and completely impacting your life. You know, so there's varying levels of impairment and how you're able to deal with it. Unaspected Mercury, unaspected Mars as well is something that I've found because an unaspected planet is kind of, it's like it's got a rocket underneath it. It's really exaggerated. I've also found strong angular Neptunes, which you would think about how there's a lack of boundaries there with Neptune. There's also, you know, absorbing things in a more intuitive way rather than a stepwise logical way. but more angular Neptunes. Yeah, first house, seventh house, 10th house, fourth house. They seem to be a pattern that appears in people's charts. Jupiter Mars aspects, especially conjunction. And when you think of Jupiter having that higher vision of what it wants, you know, spiritually, from a learning perspective, it's higher ideals, and you've got Mars, the motivator. So it motivates you to do the things you want to do, but not the things that you don't want to do, you know. Third house, obviously, you look at the third house ruler. Is it debilitated in any way? And what planets are in the third house? And what condition are those third house planets? What else? Gemini
Well,
stelliums, yeah, Gemini stelliums, yeah. And
Gemini.
funnily enough, fifth house, you know, I found lots of fifth house stelliums. And, you know, when I was looking at the charts of, you know, my clients, a lot of them that have said, look, I've either been diagnosed with ADHD or I think I have got it, based on the fact that my kids have got it and they've been diagnosed with it. Yeah. So a lot of the people that have got ADHD that I've worked with are very creative people, you know, playwrights, musicians, architects. And then you look at the chart of, you know, like Robbie Williams and Ozzy Osbourne and Jamie Oliver, and, you know, it doesn't mean you have to have a fifth house stellium, but they tend to have a lot of planets in the fifth house.
That creativity, that, you know, it just means so. There's so many things I want to say. I was just thinking about that Gemini stellium, and you know that you talk about, and then of course you were talking about Mars, and I feel that Mars square to Jupiter also, because of the frustration of the speed, wanting everything at speed and at once, and then how do I get that, you know, that you could just feel the frustration. And I was thinking about Mars because of the restlessness, you know, that impulsivity of Mars and wanting to act.
And so, yeah, Mars in water, you know, Mars in Cancer, it's not great, you know, and quite often very strong Mars, you know, is, so whereas the other planets, I was talking more about debilitated planets, with Mars, it's like Mars in Scorpio, Mars in Aries can be a problem, you know, because
I have a question for you, and this is a fairly challenging question, and I think it's kind of an open one for us all to consider. Is the problem the individual, or is the problem the world we have created? Because it is so funnel like in its structure that it's creating problems for many people who are of a more creative disposition.
Well, you know, so some of the reading that I've done on ADHD is identifying past historical, creative, scientific figures who may have had ADHD, but obviously Isaac Newton will never 100% know, Einstein will never 100% know. So a bit like with autism, there's that, you know, is it a new condition, or is it a condition that has been around for centuries but has just been undiagnosed? Is it that people are more aware of it, more aware of the characteristics, more? But I understand what you're saying. You know, the way that we teach children, you know, if you think about Steiner schools, Montessori schools, where their approach is a bit more child-centered, and
Much more.
and also critical thinking. You don't give the child the answer. You know, how's a rainbow made? You don't go, right, it's like light and a water droplet. You go, right, when do you see a rainbow? What's the weather like when there's a rainbow? You know, you ask those questions so the child is using critical thinking techniques to come up with the answer themselves. Whereas here it's like, a rainbow is made by this, memorize it.
And that is very interesting, because I think what I was going to ask you is, have you looked at the charts of these figures that you were saying, like Isaac Newton, and have you?
I haven't. No, I haven't.
You haven't, because I think the next thing to do would be to look at those charts and check for the markers that we've been
Yes.
discussing. But what you talk about in terms of the way in which we should be teaching versus the way in which we are teaching is absolutely fundamental, to the point where when I first started learning about dog behaviorism, and so there were two schools of well, there's more than one school of thought, but even within the positive reinforcement school, which is you don't shout at your dog and you don't punish your dog when your dog makes a mistake. You encourage your dog and you reward your dog for the good things. So even within that, there is a huge spectrum, and there's those who are very mechanical and task based, which is very much about conditioning. So you condition your dog. This is how you teach your dog. You train your dog by conditioning your dog, and you condition your dog by rewarding him every time he does something. Whereas others, which are very much more interesting, are saying, actually, rather than treating your dog like a machine that you program, you give your dog choice and you allow the dog to work out what you're asking him to do. Instead of showing him all the time, you say, would you like this little tidbit that I have here? And and then give him the puzzle and let him work it out. Because now what you're teaching your dog is confidence and self-reliance. Now, this is exactly the same principle that we're talking about. And it seems that although we all would benefit from being taught in this way, some of us really need that even more, because otherwise it's that constriction. And when we were talking about these historical figures, what did they not have? They did not have the education system that we have, that is really education by numbers. It's, this is the formula, this is how you do it. And we're child-centered when actually the child doesn't figure into it at all, because what matters is the Ofsted results. So it's a very interesting thing that you've brought up here.
And there might be also that the actual amount of information. Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite facts, and I'm probably misquoting how I read it, but if you read a broadsheet newspaper from cover to cover, in doing that, you have absorbed more information than a person living in the 18th century did in their entire life. Right? Have our brains developed since the 18th century to such a level that they can have broadsheet paper, Netflix, yeah? So there might be a level of hypersensory stimulation out there that is causing overwhelmment in adults as well as children. I don't know all the facts and figures about it. I'm just making, based on that fact, that means that we are completely bombarded with so much more, thousands of times more information than people from the 18th century did.
And that's very interesting, again, because if you take a mind that's hyper or prone to being hyper, like a Mercury in Gemini, or a Mercury in Sagittarius, or a Mercury in Virgo, if you take an active mind already and you hype it up with the stimulation, the level of stimulation that's out there, what we're not doing is we're not teaching the calm, how to switch off, which brings me back again. It's extraordinary how, since having Teddy and looking at the world of dogs, has brought me back to developmental psychology in a way I had not expected. But it's exactly the same thing, because when we have hyper dogs, people are very tempted to give them long walks, to do lots of, activities to keep them busy, to tire them out. And it's absolutely contraindicated. It's counterintuitive, because you want to tire them physically. But the thing that's actually going to help them is to teach them to be calm. And you teach them to be calm by giving them puzzles and getting their brains engaged, so that they're having to be present and in the moment, rather than whoosh, everything happening all at once, the overstimulation of all of that extra activity, when really what you want to do with them is giving them sniffing games, things that slow them down, slow their brain down, help them to reconnect with their bodies. And then you have a calmer dog. And when you have a calmer dog, then you introduce the more exciting stuff in small doses. So it's a very interesting comparison here, to what you've just said.
And I run 3 shamanic circles every month in London. I've been doing it for about a year and a half. And now and again, I'll get someone at the end come up to me when I'm packing up my drum and Tibetan bowls and all that. And they'll say, oh, I've got ADHD and I just feel like I've had 8 hours sleep in the past hour. And then, a few weeks later, someone else will come up to me, oh, I've got ADHD. My mind is still, But a few weeks later, someone else come up to me, I've got ADHD and I'm not thinking about anything at the moment. That's like a remark. So like you've mentioned with Teddy, that calmness, soothing environment, being still, relaxing, that can then be so much more beneficial to calm the mind, to stop that hyperactivity, the hyperfocus, the OCD, So meditation, group work,
and the drumming, because what are you doing in that moment is you're being in the moment. And it's those activities that bring you back to being present. And what does that do? That embodies as well. You're back in your body as well. Wow, what a fantastic thing you've been doing. These wonderful observations. And I love that you've done it. Thank you so much, Anita. I know that your time is short today, but so I just want to say thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome. It was lovely to share my insights with you and hear obviously your what you've been doing with ADHD and your work and what you've learned as an astrologer and a hypnotherapist. I didn't mean
hypnotherapist.
I was thinking of hyper focus and I'm getting all that.
Thank you. Now, if people would like to listen to Anita's talk, the thing to do is go on to the website for the Astrological Lodge of London, a link to which will be in the description box. And if you would like to talk to Anita and maybe see her either for ADHD or any other reason, how do they do that, Anita?
So my website is www.multidimensionalhealing.co.uk and my email is anita@multidimensionalhealing.co.uk, or you can give me a ring 07757 540 436.
I will put a link to all of that in the description box. Thank you once again.
You're welcome. Thanks you so much, Anna. Have a good rest of the evening.
Thank you. And thank you all for watching. Next time, we're going to be looking at Juno. Until then, goodbye. But before you sign off, I've just remembered, do have a look at my Substack, the link to which will also be in the description box, because I am writing about many different things. If you're interested in plants, I'm writing about plants. If you're interested in animals, I'm writing about the Teddy adventures, and the astrology side of things is I am writing about each new moon, full moon, and each ingress that we have into a new sign this year, because there's lots of planets doing exactly that. So do follow me on Substack. Goodbye for now. Have a fantastic week.